Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week, along with my co-host, Rebecca Sugar, we make sense out of the nonsense and bring a little bit of sanity to your week. Liz, welcome. Liz Truss served as the 56th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, during which she led the nation in mourning for Queen Elizabeth I and second, excuse not. We actually, we have an editorial out this week about King Charles' visit to the Vatican coming up. So I had the Reformation on the mind, as well as the ascension of Charles III to the throne. Prior to being Prime Minister, she served as Foreign Secretary, International Trade Secretary, a range of other government positions. And in another historical achievement, she was the first and I think still only female Lord Chancellor in some 1,000 years of the British crown. So, Liz, it's amazing to have you with us. Let me start off by asking, how did you get into politics? What problem did you want to solve? What issue did you want to address? What was kind of your political origin story?
So the first sort of involvement I had in politics or knowledge of politics was my mother was a very left-wing activist in the 1980s, and she was campaigning against the bomb, the nuclear bomb, and she was involved in the CND, and she was involved in the Ecology Party, which was the precursor to the Green Party. So I sort of met all of these left-wing socialist types, and the 80s was very polarized in Britain. You had Mrs. Thatcher and you had these sort of lefties, of which my mother was one. And I guess it's what got me involved in thinking about the world. And we were talking about the Soviet Union and America and all these big things going on. And I was living in a part of Britain called, I lived in both Paisley and Leeds. And both of these places were former industrial towns. So they had a proud history, cotton mills, wool mills, lovely old buildings, but they were hugely depressed. And I just had this sense that I wanted things to be good again in Britain. I just felt that people acted as though our best days were behind us as a country. You had these fractious left-wing activists who were in and out of our house the whole time. And I guess it was seeing Mrs. Thatcher as Prime Minister, all of those things just made me think politics is something where the big decisions are made, where our country is shaped. And I want to be part of that.
I heard you say that it was in college at university that you really started to maybe turn, which is unique. Today, not too many people go to college and become more conservative. But
I am a contrarian. Yeah. I think that's part of my nature as well, that I also think about things from first principles. And I've always believed in personal freedom. I've always wanted to have control of my own destiny. And I was frustrated. I'm quite anti-authority in some ways. I was frustrated if people told me what I could and couldn't do. And when I went to university, I studied economics. The penny dropped about how the world worked. And I thought, it is nuts what we're doing. We're spending so much money on welfare. As I've said, all of these great industries that once Britain was at the center of, we started the Industrial Revolution. Somehow we've become a backwater. Why is that?
Yeah.
And it was really studying economics and also just being away from home. So at home, literally everybody I knew was left wing. And I'd not really met a Tory. Mm. And I think when I went to university, I met Tories. I thought, yeah, I can be part of this.
Yeah. Did you look up to Margaret Thatcher? What was was she a relevant kind of person or something to push off against or to aspire to?
She was just very, it was just a very interesting time. And yes, she was clearly a strong leader who was doing things differently. I think President Reagan as well, what was going on in the United States, what was happening in the USSR, the fall of the Berlin Wall happened when I was 14. So it was all very, maybe I was a bit older actually at the fall of Berlin Wall, but it was all happening at that time. And that was just really exciting. And, and to be honest, life in those days, it felt quite humdrum. And one of the things I did then was, I did my first visit to London. I think I was about 11 and 12. I was just like amazed by the city and thinking, this is where things are actually happening.
So speaking of Britain's best days being behind her, I just wanted to talk a little bit,
by the way,
about.
They're not.
It's hard to tell when you land in Heathrow, but
I'm an optimist.
Yeah. It's morning in Britain.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about Brexit. We interviewed Ben Habib on this show a couple of weeks ago, and he said, though, you voted for Brexit and Brexit sort of happened, it never really happened, and in his view, and that you never really detached from the sort of globalist policies and the attachment to the ideology of the EU. How do you feel about that? Did Brexit actually happen for the UK, and what would you recommend?
He does have a point that it didn't really, it did happen to some extent. So we are no longer part of the EU. We don't go along to EU meetings. We don't really pay money into the EU. All is that is true. But we've still got all of the EU laws on our statute books. Laws that stop you building because there's a bat or a newt in the area. The Working Time Directive, which directs how many hours people can work a week. We've still got all of that legislation. And the British bureaucracy is still extremely powerful. And my view of the EU was it wasn't the cause of Britain's problems. I think our bureaucracy, our blob, our deep state goes back a century. Britain's decline didn't start when we joined the EU. It started long before that. But the EU certainly didn't help. So I think it was good to strip back a layer of the onion, but there's a lot of onion still there. And the sheer power of the bureaucracy, the judiciary, all of the things like the human rights laws that we have, most of those were bits of Tony Blair legislation. They had nothing to do with the EU.
I was struck by you saying that you're a kind of anti-establishmentarian or a rebel or that kind of thing. I'm thinking about, all the years that the conservatives were in power, that you were, and you were a part of that. How do you think that era will be remembered? Or sort of, I'm curious your thoughts about the journey from being a political insurgency to being the establishment, and then eventually giving way to another change. At a high level, what were the sort of mistakes or achievements, or how do you think about that era of conservative governance?
Well, I think the important thing to note here, and why I'm anti-establishment, is the establishment is now left-wing. And this is what a lot of conservatives haven't caught up with. But if you look at the politically correct views around New York dinner tables or London dinner tables, they're pro-transgender ideology, they're pro-climate change, panic, they're pro-Keynesian economics. If you want to be accepted in elite social circles in the West, you've got to be left-wing, or you've got to pretend to be left-wing. And there are lots of conservatives who are pretending to be left-wing to get along in advertising companies or get along in corporations or even get along in banking. That is where we've been. And what happened? So Margaret Thatcher turned around Britain to some extent. She made the economy better, but she didn't take on the deep state. She didn't take on the Sir Humphrey, who, and I don't know if people around here have seen Yes Minister, which was a sitcom from the 1980s, but that fundamental risk-averse, patronising bureaucracy that has existed in Britain since the 19th century was not dismantled. And I don't blame Mrs. Thatcher for that. These people are very powerful and they're very devious. But Tony Blair then made it a whole lot worse. He made the Bank of England unaccountable in 1997. He made the judiciary more powerful by creating a pseudo Supreme Court that was actually appointed by the judiciary themselves. He put in place all these laws like the Human Rights Act that empowered human rights lawyers. He created all these what we call quangos, but government organizations like the Climate Change Committee, the Migration Advisory Committee. See, what essentially happened is that prime ministers succeeding him couldn't really do anything because the bureaucracy, the judiciary were in charge. So the big mistake of the Conservative Party in 2020 was not reversing that. So we were operating within a left-wing system, with left-wing people in all the key positions, in the Bank of England, in the bureaucracy, at the senior level of the judiciary. And so when I became prime minister in 2022, I was explicitly trying to turn that around, but I only had a 2-year time horizon because of the timing of the general election. And what I found is when I sought to take on the economic orthodoxy represented by the Treasury and the Bank of England, I didn't get the support of my own colleagues in the Conservative Party. And why is that? Because they wanted to go along with the left-wing orthodoxy. They didn't want to be unpopular within a party set. They wanted to get jobs in corporates after they left office. So fundamentally, that's what's happened. Now, I would describe Keir Starmer as the last gasp of the Blair era. So if you like, we had the first Blair era, then we had the Tory Blair era, and now we've got the end of Blair era because the wheels are coming off. And what you see now in the opinion polls is Labour at 15%, which I think is very, very low. Keir Starmer is the most unpopular prime minister in history, according to focus groups and opinion polls. The Conservative Party is on 17% because people are saying, well, actually, there's not very much difference between what the Labour government did and what the Conservative government did. Both of them have delivered economic stagnation, mass migration, sky-high energy prices, huge social problems, including a growing awareness of the problem we have with Islamism. That's happened under both governments. So the public are very, very frustrated. So I think what you're going to see next is a revolution or a counter-revolution against the Blairite state. So it basically started with Blair.
What about the argument that, in 2019, Boris Johnson secured a huge mandate? How much do you blame sort of him and decisions made by conservative leaders for the sort of squandering of the conservative era, as opposed to these more structural, kind of longer term personnel issues?
So, the time when a party has the most power is when it's first elected. And that was back in 2010. And the problem was the people that got elected then and their associates, so David Cameron, George Osborne, Michael Gove, who were known as the modernisers, what they said, we want to be the heir to Blair. They didn't say we want to junk everything Blair's done because he's trashed the Constitution and he's stagnated the economy. They said we want to be the heir to Blair. So we started off on a bad footing. And throughout the period of the Conservative Party being in charge, perhaps with the brief exception of my premiership, those modernisers really remained in charge of the Conservative Party. So Boris Johnson, he did not have the political infrastructure to deliver his vision. He didn't have the bureaucrats in place because none of those Blairite things have been changed. So you still had the same people who were basically in favour of Europe, even though we'd left the EU. They were in favour of mass migration. All of those bureaucrats were still in charge. And it's quite difficult to change that midterm, which is essentially what. That's not to say Boris doesn't have failings. And in my mind, he was far too pro net zero, which has had huge damage to the British economy. He was far too pro China as well. So I'm not saying he is perfect, but what I'm saying is when the system is so rigged and when you've got these people who want to pursue a course of action, it's very difficult to turn that around. And I think if you look at America, Trump is only able to do it in the second term. because he knows how it works. He's spent 4 years preparing. He's got the people he's brought in. They'd already drafted the executive orders. That's in order to take on a blob or a deep state like we have in Britain, you need time out of office to prepare. And that's what Boris didn't have.
You mentioned immigration, and you also mentioned in the same sentence, I was happy to hear the word Islamists, which I think a lot of people are unwilling to say in the same sentence. So can you just talk about who in government today in your country do you think is taking on that issue in particular with an eye toward the specific problem of Muslim migration and what it has done to your country? And just want to point out that we had talked on the show a few weeks ago about Nigel Farage's statement that he would remigrate or deport groups of immigrants, but only the men, not the women and the children. So, even those who sort of come out strongly against this issue are not as strong as they probably should be.
Yeah, and just say, I think a lot of us, just to add onto that, have really been horrified. Not only the attack in the Manchester synagogue over Yom Kippur, but, this brewing, ban on fans of Maccabi Tel Aviv attending, a football game in England. So this question of...
But beyond it, just in the Jewish community, which is bad enough, right? This is an issue for all citizens of the UK, not just the Jewish ones. So can you speak broadly about who you have confidence in who might do something about this problem?
So the current government will do nothing about this. They will do nothing about this because they are very, very worried about the Muslim vote. And what happened at the last election is the Islamic separatists won 4 seats. You've got the Green Party, which are now equaling Labour in the polls, who are actively promoting Islamist policies. They have people in the Green Party who are advocating for Sharia law, etc., etc. So the Labour Party is facing huge electoral pressure from those parties. So you're not going to see any action. And also, if you look at the backgrounds of Keir Starmer or Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, they have never been on the pro-Israel side. That's just a reality of the situation. And many of the members of the cabinet have been spending their time appeasing Islamist interests. And they've done it systematically for years and years, the Labour Party, essentially to buy votes. So I don't think you're going to get anything. The only thing that is happening now is there are rumours that the Labour Party is going to not adopt a definition of Islamophobia because the public are getting so angry that they can't say what they think, that even Keir Starmer has woken up to this would be a massively unpopular misstep. And, people always ask me here, it's like, is it really true people are being arrested for posting on X? And it's like, yes, it is true. They're being visited in their houses late at night. They're being arrested at Heathrow Airport. One woman Lucy Connolly was imprisoned for 31 months. It's absolutely shocking what has happened to free speech in our country. And it only applies one way, I'm afraid. And this is why Keir Starmer is now known as two-tier Keir, because, if a pro-Islamist protester is saying things, they very rarely get caught out, whereas, people have been arrested for wearing the Star of David. It's a very difficult situation. And when I said, Blair had made he'd taken power away from Parliament and given it to institutions, those institutions have been captured. So our police has been captured. The Home Office has been captured. So the police are not pursuing particular ethnic groups on some types of
like rape.
Yeah.
But who on the right will take it on is my question. As the left, we all understand.
But I think it's also important to understand that with things like the rape gang scandal, that's been going on since the 1970s in Britain. So there's a recent issue of the small boats crossing the Channel, which is a big problem, and we have seen a rise in sexual crime. But there's also a very long-standing problem of towns essentially being taken over by alien culture to Britain. and perpetrating things like the rape gangs. And we know that the police have been complicit. We know that local councils have been complicit and they haven't been brought to justice. And, both the Conservative Party and the Reform Party are now talking about this issue. As you say, people are still wary because there's this culture of political correctness around talking about it. But I think by the next election, it's going to be a major issue because the public are livid, absolutely livid. I mean, the rape gang scandal is one of the biggest scandals in British history. And the fact it's still going on and these appalling abusers haven't all been brought to justice, and the complicity of the authorities it's horrific.
Do you have faith that Nigel Farage he's really in the lead with reform, or Ben Habib? I think we all could say we'd have faith that he would do something about it.
I think it's unlikely that Ben Habib will become the next prime minister. I think we can fairly say. I mean, Nigel Farage is the favourite in terms of the bookies' odds to be the next prime minister. I think these questions are still open. But what I'm saying to him, and in fact, anybody who's running, is unless you repeal the Human Rights Act, unless you make the judiciary accountable again, unless you replace the senior people in the Home Office, you're not actually going to be able to do anything. So it doesn't matter. You can use all the rhetoric you like about what's happening in our country, but the practical actions that need to be taken will require a total change of the British system, because this is a system problem. As I've said, it's been going on under successive governments. The grooming gang issue has been going on since the 70s. That is not just one prime minister being poor at their job. Yeah. That is a whole system failure.
I'm curious about your theory of political change and political statecraft. I mean, you mentioned sort of during your time at 10 Downing Street, you sort of stuck to your guns and pushed what you thought was right, specifically in the financial sphere, and didn't get the backing of your party. A lot of people, once they get to the summit, their whole strategy is how to stay there, and how to try. That
was not my strategy,
right,
as you can tell.
It was a good 50 days, but that's my question: is sort of, isn't the kind of sustained reform change you're speaking about, doesn't that need sort of hanging on to power, sort of working at it? How does that work with sort of your idea of kind of going out guns blazing? Is that really the way to change a system, or is it to work in a more pragmatic, maybe slow burn way?
So I don't think you can win with strategy 2. You just can't win. And this is what Donald Trump understands, perhaps uniquely in the Western world. I think there are others who have taken on the deep state. You might point to Viktor Orban, you might point to Bukele or Milei. But really, Donald Trump, to me, is the playbook of how you need to behave. Because a lot of people in politics think, because it was the case, in the 70s, 80s, that you could reason with the opposition, you could find a compromise, you could be bipartisan, you could persuade people, you could sell it in the media, you could roll the pitch, that strategy can be adopted now. And I think they're wrong, because the opposition have changed. We're not dealing with a load of social democrats who just want to raise taxes a bit and spend more on public spending. We're dealing with people who want to destroy Western civilization. This is what their aims are. These people want to impose Sharia law in Britain. Quite a lot of the people on the other side of the debate. They want to destroy the British energy industry with net zero. They want to run every wealthy person out of our country in the name of socialism. So it's not...
And we're not just talking about New York City.
No, but there are lots of parallels, actually, with what Mandami is saying about New York City. And those attitudes are embedded in the bureaucracy. That's the point. So if you take it slowly, they will destroy you from within. And that is why I mean, the issue I had in 2022 is the Conservatives were heading for election defeat. If we weren't turning things around by 2024, we were going to lose in a big way. And as it happened, once I was deposed, my successor, Rishi Sunak, got the worst result for the Conservative Party since 1834 because he didn't do anything. So it was a choice of doing something difficult, and maybe it would get the backlash, maybe it wouldn't, or not doing anything at all and certainly being defeated. That was the choice for the Conservative Party in 2022. And I think the choice for any government that wins in 29 is going to be take on the bureaucracy, the Blairite laws on day one, or be subsumed by it. That's the choice. And Donald Trump is probably one of the people who understands this best, because he faced it in 2016. He knew what they were trying to do. He knew how the people who were allegedly on his side were trying to undermine him. So having that political infrastructure to be able to take on the bureaucracy is absolutely vital.
Well, what happens if they don't? What if they don't take a page from Donald Trump, or they fail in some way to change things? Are you going to be less optimistic about the future of the UK at that point?
Yeah, I mean, we are on a very dangerous path. We are on a very dangerous path. I mean, people are worried in Britain about losing our way of life. It's a threat to our fundamental values. Britain is a Christian country. That is how we were founded. That is the basis of much of our success. We are founded on the concepts of ancient British liberties developed through the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights, things like freedom of speech. We're losing those things. And it's not. This is why I think it's so critical and why I care so much, because I think if it gets beyond a certain point, that loss of what we are as a country is very, very difficult to recover.
Are we at that point?
No, but I think we're close to the point. And it's why, and I do think the West as a whole is close to that point. And it's why I wrote the book I wrote last year called 10 Years to Save the West, because I think that is the time horizon we have. If you think of how long the sort of leftist Marxists have been taking over our institutions, with their, you might call them postmodernist ideas, but as I said, extreme environmentalism, Islamism, the rejection of objective truth, with movements like the transgender ideology, they have been taking over the universities, the bureaucracy, the professions for quite some time. And we've now got to a critical point. And I think America is very interesting, because whilst Donald Trump is making great strides in the White House, you're seeing the cities and you're seeing what's happening here in New York, you're seeing what's happening in California. It's still an ongoing battle here.
Let me ask you a little bit of a lighter question. What surprised you about being prime minister? What was unexpected? What was it like? I think fair to say no one else here has or ever will be prime minister.
There's only been 56 of them, so a few more since then. But I think because I'd been in around the cabinet for 10 years, so I'd been in number 10 a lot. I'd dealt with the prime minister a lot. I'd sat around the cabinet table for quite some time. So it wasn't alien to me. But I think what really surprised me is how little support the prime minister gets. And just, it is like the Wizard of Oz when you pull back the curtain and you discover there aren't the levers there that you thought there were. And
what do you mean by support? Political support or staff
like
support?
Medical support, or my husband had to order the shopping on the internet to arrive at number 10 Downing Street on our first day, things like that. And then Sainsbury's couldn't find the right entrance. This is it's not. Boris Johnson almost died of COVID, and there was no medical support in number 10. So we have a system in Britain that sort of expects presidential style leadership with all that it comes with it, but there is actually very, very low infrastructure and very low support. I mean, the number 10 apartment when we moved in had fleas. And so I think one of the other as well as sort of dealing with the British system, which is broken, and I think everyone in Britain is now recognizing it's broken, that also the whole operation needs to be much more professional, have much better infrastructure so that the Prime Minister can actually do their job. And so that's what really surprised me, that was kind of almost nothing behind the facade.
I just want to go back to the blob for a second. You talk frequently about the judiciary, and you spoke just before about it too, as being a critical part of this blob. But I don't think enough people, think of the courts as part of the problem, although we've been getting a lesson in that in this country in the last year. Can you talk specifically about how the judiciary is part of this blob that sort of impedes government and gets in the way?
So what we've had in Britain is, first of all, government policies are increasingly questioned and subject to judicial review. So the government is not able to pursue the welfare policy they want because the courts say it's not legal, particularly on illegal immigrants. We've not been able to deport people because the judges use the Human Rights Act to say this person's human rights are so important that they have to stay in the country. So, for example, somebody who was convicted of sexual abuse of his own stepdaughter was allowed to stay in Britain because of the right to family life. And it's this is nuts. This is left-wing human rights ideology gone completely crazy. And the problem is the judiciary have become out of touch with what the public understand to be just and fair. And this is why we talk about two-tier justice. And how did that happen? Well, prior to 2005, the Lord Chancellor, who sat in the cabinet, was the most senior judge in the country. They were appointed by the Prime Minister, and they appointed the senior judges. So you had a system of accountability that ran through from the Prime Minister to the senior judges. And that set the tone for the organisation. Blair got rid of that. And he said he created a Supreme Court, which never existed in Britain before. This is only in 2005. And he said he created a Judicial Appointments Commission, which was made up of the great and the good. And as we know, the great and the good are all left-wing. They were the ones who got to appoint the judges. So we've totally divorced how the electorate vote from how the judges are appointed. And the judges are becoming increasingly involved in political decisions as well. And that law needs to be repealed. And I think people are becoming more aware of it as they see constant promises by prime ministers to stop the boats or deport illegal immigrants, and that is just not happening.
Can I just ask one other question about free speech? The state of free speech in the UK is just, I don't have words to even use on how horrible it is. I wonder what you see the population in the streets, you see people pushing back. Do you think that the Graham Lynham arrest was a turning point? Do you think that the population will stand for this much longer? Or I wonder what needs to happen. Can you tell us what could happen that could change this problem and not just change it, but reverse it? And maybe even, I asked this question of Ben Habib too, what could a Liz Truss premiership do today to make sure that this doesn't happen again?
So on free speech, essentially, there are lots of laws that have been passed, actually including the 1986 Public Order Act under Mrs. Thatcher, that have been used to police free speech. The most famous of them is the Online Safety Act.
Which I believe you supported while in office, and now definitely don't.
I actually can't say whether as Prime Minister, I was going to amend it, but I didn't get to that stage, unfortunately, because I wasn't in office long enough. But I was going to amend it to protect free speech, and I did commit to that during my leadership campaign. So there's a whole series of acts that have been used to persecute people for speaking out. But there's a second problem, which is the police and the judiciary. So the police can choose, they are operationally independent, they can choose which crimes they go after. So they could go after you for posting something on X rather than go after Ari for burgling a house. That's their choice. And the problem is the police have been captured by the ideologues into pursuing people for, Graham Lineman was posting about transgender ideology. And organizations like Stonewall have become very powerful, and they've, organizations like the police wanted to be Stonewall champions. So this is how it's happened. So what a future prime minister needs to do is not only repeal all the laws we've just been talking about, but they actually need to make the police accountable. And they need to make the judiciary accountable and abolish this idea of operational independence, which is just another excuse for being unaccountable. They need to do all that to actually change things. And I think people who haven't been in government don't understand quite how deep the rot is.
Do you also need like a pro-speech legislation
No,
to prevent this from happening again?
Because we have the Bill of Rights, 1689. We had free speech in Britain until all these laws were invented.
That's where we got it from.
We had free speech. This is the point. And we had property rights, before things like the Petroleum Act and the Town and Country Planning Act. The problem is all of the legislation that's been passed, particularly over the last 30 years, but a few bits over the last 100 years, have damaged what used to be a very free country. And the whole British system, we don't have a written constitution. We have the concept of parliamentary sovereignty. The good thing about Britain is if you had a group of really dedicated MPs, you could turn all this around. It wouldn't actually take very long. It's just a question of whether they're prepared to do it and whether they're prepared to take the backlash, which would be massive. If you look at the backlash to Donald Trump and all these lefties protesting on the street and all this sort of no king stuff and what you hear on CNN, etc., it would be like that on steroids, trying to get rid of all this legislation in Britain because the left elite are benefiting from it.
Okay. Another lighter question for me. Can you tell us anything about the royal family?
That's not a light question. Have you not been following what's been happening with Prince Andrew?
I know.
Really,
That's what I was thinking of.
Specifically Meghan Markle.
Your light questions are pretty heavy.
The former Duke of York. Did you get to know any of them? What have your interactions with the family been like? What do you feel comfortable saying? What kind of role do the royals have in some of these questions of English identity? Yeah.
So I was appointed by Her Late Majesty, and we'd had one meeting before that, I think, and we had the meeting when I was appointed, and she was very she just had such massive experience here. She'd been on the throne for 70 years. She had such she's very funny as well and witty, and she completely understood what was going on in Britain. And at the end of the meeting, she said, "I'll see you again next week." And then she went to bed and never got up again. I mean, that is what happened. That was the start of my premiership. And, I think she was a huge loss to the nation. But I think the royal family, and certainly my experience of politics, they're just not involved in politics. I sometimes hear Americans suggesting that King Charles could get involved in X or Y. That would never, ever, ever happen. They're not involved. They're not part of politics. They're part of our national life, but they're not part of politics. And I think it's a bit of a misnomer of this side of the Atlantic.
So you're not going to comment on Meghan Markle? And we apologize on America's behalf.
Well, just as long as she stays here and keeps Prince Harry here, we're all happy.
Fair enough. Okay, we have some questions from the audience. I thought this was a fun one, actually, something I was thinking about. Britain has a wide range of overseas territories it occupies, from the Falklands to Gibraltar, Northern Ireland, elsewhere. Is it hypocritical?
Northern Ireland's part of.
Yeah, I was going to say occupy loosely. Yeah. Depends who you ask. Okay. Is it hypocritical for the UK to recognize Palestine given its own overseas possessions?
Britain should never have recognized Palestine, and it was a political move. It was a totally political move, and it contributed absolutely nothing to the peace process which Donald Trump had conducted. We have a massive issue in Britain with this anti-Israel attitude, which also exists in our bureaucracy. So I spent a lot of time as Foreign Secretary overruling the bureaucrats who wanted to vote for anti-Israel motions at the UN. So, that the whole recognition of Palestine was ludicrous. I think what was interesting about it for me is it was Macron, it was Carney, it was Albanese. And what this shows to me is the left are very internationally coordinated. They put pressure on leaders to do things. I think, Starmer is a follower, not a leader. And if we are to win the civilizational battle that I believe we're in, we need to have a better and stronger network to take them on. So that's what I learned from that.
Great. This is from Karen. I saw that Europe is no longer home to any of the top 25 companies in the world. As an American, I would love to hear your perspective on how this came to be and what it means for the UK's future.
I mean, I started this talk by talking about industrial decline in Britain, which actually started at the end of the 19th century. And even by the early 20th century, we were being overtaken by Germany and the US in terms of our industrial production, even though we were home of the Industrial Revolution. There was a revival in the 80s under Mrs. Thatcher, but this comes down to supply side economics. If you put lots of regulation on business, if you make it impossible to build anything, if you raise taxes on corporations, if you make energy costs really expensive, you're unlikely to attract great businesses to operate in your country. And anybody with talent and get up and go is likely to leave for somewhere that is more open to entrepreneurship. And if you think the British bureaucracy is bad, the EU bureaucracy is even worse. And that is why Europe is a failing continent. And it just is. So if you look at where we were in the year 2000, the average Brit was almost as rich as the average American. Our GDP per capita was similar. The average American is now 50% better off. The GDP per capita is now 50% higher in America than it is in Britain. And it's even higher in the state of Mississippi, which is the poorest American state, than it is in the whole of Britain. That's how bad it is. And it is 30 years of terrible economic policy, of loose money and money printing, frankly, of increasing regulations, particularly on things like land use. Taxes are now the highest for 70 years. And one of the big measures in my mini budget it wasn't about tax cuts. It was just about not raising corporation tax from 19 to 25%, because I knew that would send us above the Laffer curve and actually wouldn't bring in the revenue and growth expected.
Maybe just tell people what the Laffer curve is. Just
the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve, I've got a lot of supply side experts in this audience, I know. But the Laffer curve essentially means that once you raise tax rates beyond a certain level, you reduce the level of revenue, each extra bit of revenue you get, until ultimately you actually reduce revenue altogether. So what I'm saying is that by raising taxes too high, we choked off investment in our country, we choked off entrepreneurship, and we actually ended up bringing in less tax revenues overall. That's what the Laffer curve is. And the Laffer curve works. And it's also become a stronger effect because it's easier to relocate your company elsewhere thanks to the internet. If you're building an AI company, you're going to decide to locate it in somewhere with cheap energy. You're not going to decide to locate it in the country with the highest energy prices in the world, which is currently what we have in Britain. So there's a very simple explanation of why Europe is a museum. The question is, how on earth do we get out of it? And the only answer is stripping back all of the bureaucracy, all of the regulation, all of the blob. But these people fight like hell, and they're very powerful. The central banks are very powerful. I found that the treasuries are very powerful. And what we've done is we've built all these industries that essentially suck off the teat of the state. So, for example, the green energy industry, which is a bit of a non-industry as far as I'm concerned. It's only there because of government subsidies. Or the banking sector, which heavily depends on regulation by the government. So there's all these kind of industries that aren't really industries as well. And that's what's gone wrong with Europe. We just don't have the entrepreneur class now that America has.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned that, of course, you were foreign secretary. We have a question, foreign policy. What's next? And I guess I'd add, what is the UK's role in the two major wars now in Gaza and in the Ukraine? What role should Britain play?
Well, I am very pro-Israel in my stance. I wanted to move our embassy to Jerusalem. If I'd stayed as prime minister for long enough, I think we need to deal with I support Israel and what it's done, taking on the terrorists, Hamas, Hezbollah, and also fighting back after the appalling massacre on October the 7th. I mean, the British government policy is terrible. But as I think Marco Rubio has pointed out, it's actually not that important in the scheme of things. So I don't think Britain has actually had a very big influence on what's happened. I think it's all been about the domestic audience in Britain, which is pretty shoddy. As for Ukraine, the British armed forces are not what they were. That's the reality of the situation. Again, I think it is America that is going to be the lead on sorting out the situation. What I want to see is I do not want to see Putin rewarded for the war that he has perpetrated in Ukraine. And I think the best way of dealing with him is through energy and the American energy dominance policy of making oil and gas so abundant that it's no longer the source of revenue that it was for Putin.
Mm-hmm. Great. Rebecca, do you have a last question?
I do. I'm just wondering if you want to re-enter politics, if that's on your mind, and if so, which party would you join?
It's kind of weird, but I sort of feel like I haven't left. And politics don't, it's interesting. Politics doesn't leave you. So honestly, I walk down the street in Britain and people give me their opinion on political issues. I spend a lot of time talking about politics, writing about politics. I think the advantage of not being in frontline politics at the moment is it gives me time to think. It also gives me time to meet other people who share my values in a much more free way. So when you're a government minister, you're almost trapped in a sort of prison. It's very difficult to meet people, interact with people, build alliances. Because, first of all, the day job is so demanding, but also there's so much bureaucracy built around who you can and can't meet, etc. So I want to build up the network of people that are on the side of Western civilization. I think that's vital. I think we're facing a very powerful network of leftists who are trying to destroy Western civilization. We need to fight back. I'm planning to start a new free speech media network, hopefully very soon. That's what we need to do. So what I'm into at the moment is building the infrastructure that is actually going to make the politics possible. And then, but I never rule anything out. So, who knows?
Liz Truss, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.